Welcome to the Valor Flight Crew podcast, hosted by Echo and brought to you by Vertical Helicasts and Vertical Valor magazine. In this episode, we're diving into the mindset of the Resuscitationist and what it takes to perform under pressure when every second counts. This week, we are joined by Dr. Garrett Cavaliere as we explore how preparation, teamwork, and self-awareness shape outcomes in high-stress environments like flight medicine. We'll talk about managing stress responses, the impact of fatigue, the power of mental rehearsal, and the value of debriefing after critical incidents. If you're in the business of saving lives under pressure, this conversation is one you won't want to miss. Throughout this episode, various studies and graphs are referenced by Dr. Cavaliere, so be sure to head over to our YouTube channel to get the full effect of this conversation. Thank you to our sponsors, Metro Aviation, Airbus, and Precision Aviation Group.
Welcome to the Valor Flight Crew podcast, brought to you by Vertical Helicasts and Vertical Valor magazine. Produced in partnership with Echo, Every Coast Helicopter Operations, the Valor Flight Crew podcast promotes the personnel and life-saving equipment behind helicopter air ambulance services. Join hosts Mike Fideli and Blake Schreider for in-depth interviews and expert insights from air medical personnel, pilots, communication specialists, and maintenance crews who play critical roles in airborne emergency response.
Line 1 accepting.
Copy, Line 1, gotcha, accepting. You're going to be talking to Red Feather 1 on LCEMS.
Welcome back to the Valor Flight Crew podcast. Mike Fideli here with Blake Schreider. We are your hosts for the Valor Flight Crew podcast. How you doing today, Blake?
Doing okay, Mike. How about you?
I can't complain. We're finally stopped raining here in Pennsylvania, so hopefully the sun will be out a little bit later and warm up this weekend. I can't believe it's
down to us. We
I
need
can't
rain
believe it's
so
May
bad.
and I had to use my heated seats and heat in the car yesterday. It was not okay.
Well,
It's definitely
if
not.
it's any consolation, it's like 104 is the feels like heat index down here. So
You know what? I'll take it. You know how I love Florida.
you do. Now we'll trade. We'll maybe I could be the snowbird, but up north, and you can come down here for summers, and I'll go up there.
Perfect. Sounds great. Sounds great.
Traded.
Well, I've got a great show for you guys today. This is something that kind of came about a couple weeks ago, where we have our grand rounds at the program that I fly at. And I thought this was a very interesting topic for pretty much everyone to hear. And it's talking about the mindset of the resuscitationist. And I think that, especially lately, we've been really involved with some very high acuity cases, some very difficult transports. And I feel like that's only getting worse and worse and worse. And I feel like that's been consistent over the past, 6, 8, 10 months, where our acuity keeps going up. And I felt like having that discussion about the mindset of the resuscitationist and what we're doing on a day-to-day basis and how we're functioning in those high stress environments was something that really could be beneficial across all of our listeners rather than just at a program level. So I wanted to bring in my medical director, Dr. Garrett Cavaliere, to be able to talk through this topic, as he's the one that had presented it at our grand rounds. So without further ado, I'd like to introduce Dr. Garrett Cavaliere. Garrett, welcome. How are you?
Welcome.
Good morning, guys. I, like Mike, am excited to have a little bit warmer weather and super jealous of you, Blake, because it's just 52 degrees here yesterday and absolutely awful.
Yeah, it was not fun at all and poured the entire day. So,
Man,
Well, Garrett-
I'll trade that.
you can have it. Garrett, thank you so much for being willing to come on and talk with us about this, because I feel this is certainly a topic that all of us can relate to. And I think that we can make this topic not just about the clinicians itself, but the entire team environment in our HAA environment. And I think that it's something that's extremely important for all of us to kind of embrace and understand as we're moving forward. And hopefully this will help to make us better clinicians, especially in those high stress environments. So before we get started, I was wondering if you can just give us a little bit of background on yourself and your experience.
Sure. And by the way, thank you so much for having me. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart, and I think is at its core what we do as a flight program, what we do as critical care clinicians. And we really need to know how to do this very well, usually in very high stress environments. So this lays in perfectly one with this podcast and our day-to-day. So a little bit about me. So hi, I'm Garrett Cavaliere. I'm the medical director for Penn State Health Lifeline Critical Care Transport. My background is as a firefighter paramedic in a combined volunteer career fire EMS department outside of Washington, D.C., where I was also an engine company supervisor. Super fun, high acuity, high penetrating trauma. So that was when I first really got it into kind of the higher levels of EMS. Fast forward through medical school, I did residency at University of Maryland and R. Adams Cali Shock Trauma in emergency medicine. I then further specialized in EMS and disaster medicine at Rutgers and RWJ Barnabas Health. And then with that, I further subspecialized more into flight critical care. So that ultimately led me to Penn State Health because I wanted a hospital-based Part 135 flight program. They were lucky enough to take me on, so I'm super grateful for that. And I've been here ever since. I'm an assistant professor of emergency medicine. I'm core faculty for our EMS fellowship program as well. So I get to train our fellows. I get to train our residents. I get to hang out with our flight crews. I'm one of the operational EMS physicians with our urban search and rescue for Pennsylvania. I'm also one of the operational EMS physicians on both the ground and the flight side. So ton of fun being here, and let's have fun, guys.
Yeah, for sure. We're certainly glad to have you as medical director. It's certainly, I think ever since I've been at Lifeline, there's always been a very heavy involvement from our medical director's side. And that certainly continues with you. And we really appreciate that and being able to have a lot of these conversations. Before, again, we kind of get into the meat and potatoes of things, I wonder if you can just share maybe an impactful story from your career that you can think back on that was something that kind of sets the tone for why we're having this discussion about the mindset of the resuscitationist.
So I would love to, and I love to preface this with, we all make mistakes. We all learn from those mistakes. And this was a great case from when I was a junior attending. And like all things, these are all Swiss cheese models. So everything lines up and things go wrong, and there's plenty of opportunities for intervention. And part of this podcast today and this talk is really trying to find where can we have better preparations, and within the moment, how do we perform better and optimally to really prevent these outcomes. So this was I oopsed on this one a little bit. It was a trauma patient who came in, broke both their arms, dislocated one hip, broke mid femur on the other side, upper extremity, had a right radial and ulnar fracture, and a left, I want to say it was a humeral fracture. So I just came out of sign out, and they's like, hey, look, she's got all these orthopedic injuries. We don't have time to go to the OR today for it. And then the next thing we know, they're like, well, can't you just do the sedation? I was like, yeah, we can probably do the sedation. I should have thought to myself, oh, yeah, I forgot to mention, she also had a T3 or T4 burst fracture. So she was in C-spine precaution, T-spine precautions, L-spine precautions, and broke all four of her extremities and had to go to the OR.
That's a bad day.
One would think, right? Like, talk about a really bad day. So little public service announcement, wear your seatbelt. And don't drink and drive.
Right? Yeah.
So as long as we're doing these things, we should be in good shape. So I was like, yeah, you know what? We'll do the sedation. I'll drop her deep with some propofol, and you guys can do your thing. I'm looking at this morbidly obese female who is most of our patient populations at this point, who's laying flat, who's got a very large neck, a large, posterior oral pharynx, and the red flag should have been there that, hey, maybe this is a poor decision to make. I should probably just intubate her. But I was like a junior attending, fresh out of a top program, fellowship trained. I do flight critical care. I've taken thousands of airways. I'm like, we're good. Lo and behold, I put her down with propofol, and she stops breathing, which we all could have expected that was going to happen.
Naturally.
And I didn't prepare the room. I didn't really prepare my team. I knew she was at high risk for airway compromise. My resident, I told him to be prepared, but I didn't prepare the room. We didn't do a 0-point survey, which we'll talk about a little bit later. We didn't do any of these things that I should have done. So she stops breathing. I'm like, no worries. We can start bagging her. So they grabbed the pediatric bag that was on the wall, even though it was an adult room, which I'm like, okay, that's fine, except we didn't have an adult mask.
Yeah.
So then the patient's now desatting until someone came in with the correct bag. So now we're bagging the patient. I'm like, all right, we should probably intubate this patient. So I'll go forward with the intubation. The intubation went fine. The patient did have some bad, I'm not going to say decels, but she started to brady a little bit. So we bagged her back up. All is well. She gets intubated. Ortho does their thing, which was a lot easier to do once, she had rocuronium on board. It makes it a lot easier for muscle relaxation. They love it.
Absolutely, yes.
And I'm like, all right, well, we're just going to wake her up now. So the procedures took about 45, 50 minutes. I did a quick RISB, so rapid shallow breathing index on her to make sure that she could extubate. Did an SBT, so she passed her SBT, so that's a spontaneous breathing trial. I'm like, all right, let's just extubate her. She's, meanwhile, still laying flat, still in T-spot precautions. I just gave her a boatload of rock.
Yeah.
They're like, well, she should fly. And again, didn't prep the team, didn't do a 0-point survey, didn't make sure everything was available for us, and move forward with the extubation. I was like, well, we should have just extubate onto BiPAP because I know she's laying flat, probably sleep apnea, which should have then been also another red flag instead of saying, hey, she's going to the OR tomorrow. Why don't we just keep her intubated? But we had no surgical ICU beds. The intensivist like, hey, if you can extubate her, that'll really help us out. So I'm like, all right, fine. Let's go forward, and we extubate her. And she doesn't breathe. And I'm just looking at her. I'm like, breathe. And she looks up at me and goes like this. What do you know?
Shaking head, no.
This is kind of needed for life sustainability. You have to breathe. I need you to breathe.
Yes.
She just refuses to breathe. And now we're bagging her again. And I'm like, God damn it. All right, so we put her on BiPAP. I gave her a re. So now she's on the equivalent of AVAPs. Give her a volume with it. And she still doesn't want to trigger. I was like, what on earth isn't going? She's desatting again. We have to take the BiPAP off. I give her a big bolus of ketamine and then just rock her again and just re-intubate her. And now I'm just thinking to myself, I'm going to end up in meetings.
Yeah.
For the better part of a century.
A lot of meetings.
For me to shoot a chest x-ray to realize that she just had like this massive mucus plug and completely dropped her right lung. So then I just go and I bronch her, I suction out the mucus plug and she's fine. And look at the resident. The resident's like, should we try and extubate her again? And I'm like, nope.
Not happening.
She stayed intubated until she finishes all of her ortho procedures, which she turned out fine. Afterwards, she remembered the event. She's like, I felt like I wanted to breathe, but I just didn't. And the nurse came in to me. She goes, are we sure the rock wore off? I'm like, she was breathing on her own. The rock wore off.
Yeah.
She plugged and lost her respiratory drive. She was just too obese to overcome a single lung physiology event. And then I thought to myself that if I had prepared the room better, if I had prepared the patient better, if I had done any of these preparatory phases, this probably would not have happened. So from a leader's perspective, I failed my team in preparation, which ultimately, thank God, didn't lead to any patient-centered outcome problems. But it was a good learning experience for me and the rest of the team.
I think when you go through and you tell these stories, like, at least I know I'm over here, like on the edge of my seat, like, no, don't do that. No, don't do that. and we always Monday morning quarterback all of this stuff that we're doing. But in the moment, there's sometimes that cascade of events that just continually sets yourself up for failure. And the things that you should be thinking about, the things you should be doing. And for some reason, they just end up escaping your mind in that particular moment. And I think there's so many things that kind of factor into that, which we'll certainly talk about throughout this entire podcast. But I appreciate you sharing that story with us, just as like a little preface for, why we're getting into the meat and potatoes of this resuscitationist and their mindset.
And it happens to all of us. It does. It happens to me. It happens to our junior flight crew members. It happens to my residents. It happens to the fellows. It happens to our 25-year flight provider. None of us are immune to this.
No one is.
Yeah, these things can just come in on even you think you're having your best day, and like you pointed out earlier, the Swiss cheese model, right? So your mindset is one thing. You're thinking of doing the right thing for the patient. You're thinking, I have to do A, B, C, and D. But then you get those small distractions or those small interruptions, right? Where someone comes in and says, hey, we need this for room 10. And you're like, oh, yeah, okay, go ahead, do that. And like you said, you had what ortho was saying, hey, maybe you could extubate her, or, maybe we could get her out of this and just kind of like, and you're like, oh, okay, yeah, maybe we could do that. It's all those little Swiss cheese, the little holes, and then they just eventually really line up. And it wasn't any ill intention. It's just those small little bits of distractions. And what I've noticed over the past few years of really honing and really training on resuscitation is really trying to stick to a systematic and regimented approach like using checklists, things like that, to really make sure that we are setting not only ourselves, but the patient up for success to do these resuscitations and we know those distractions may happen, but we can train and refocus and go back and go through that systematic format to make sure we're successul.
Exactly.
I always like to say that Murphy is alive and well. And if I ever meet him in a dark alley with no witnesses, it is on for sure. And then I might just save him to then just do that again.
Resuscitate again. Yeah, there you go.
Yes, exactly. All right. So when we talk about resuscitationist, Garrett, and how it relates to flight medicine, what would be kind of your take on what that role is and how that functions?
Thank you to our sponsor, Metro Aviation. Metro Aviation, the world's largest family-owned aeromedical operator, offers comprehensive aircraft services with 140 plus aircraft in over 25 states. The Completion Center installs medical and law enforcement kits and avionics, serving diverse aviation needs including offshore, utility, VIP, and corporate sectors.
So I view that role as every single one of us on the team and every single person who flies, even most of us on the ground. We are resuscitationists. That's our number one job here. We're not working up on a floor. Even if we are working in an ICU sometimes, our number one goal is to resuscitate the critically sick and injured patients. That's why they call us for these scene flights. That's why they call us for these outside hospitals to bring them to the larger quaternary, tertiary centers. They're calling us because the patient is really sick and we need to do something to fix them. Now, is that fixing them definitively? Sometimes. Is it fixing them temporarily? Usually. So our goal is to really resuscitate them so that we can get them to whatever care they need, whether it be a procedure, or sometimes it's just we need to optimize them on the ventilator. We need to optimize their hemodynamics so that we can let nature do its thing. We can let the antibiotics start working if they're septic. If they need a cardiovascular procedure, we can reperfuse them. We can give them mechanical circulatory support just for their myocardium to kind of relax. We can take them for cranies. We need to do something to save this patient in front of us. And it's time critical, time sensitive. And that's what separates us from really that acute care provider. We're providing immediate life-saving therapies in a time sensitive nature. So to simply answer your question, what is a resuscitationist and how does it relate to flight medicine? It's us. It's every single one of us who's doing this job.
Yeah, and I think that, your overall mindset or how you're even going into a lot of these situations in the first place, just with the little itty bitty parts and pieces of information that you're getting, really are kind of what helps set that stage for us. And I was wondering if, you can kind of talk a little bit about, your mindset going into some of these situations, whether you're receiving a patient, in the ER, whether you're out flying with us, that kind of is starting the ball rolling of how you're going to tackle those situations and how much that mindset plays into everything.
So the mindset is everything here, and your approach to these patients is everything. If you approach that every single patient has nothing wrong with them, you are going to miss things. Likewise, if you approach every single patient as if they are actively dying in front of you, you're going to be too aggressive on these patients as well. So you really need to have an open mind and a blend of healthy cynicism. I think there's something wrong. There might be nothing, but there might be something. So I need to have an open mind. I can't tunnel vision. I can't have anchoring bias. I need to reassess my patient. And then I need to have a very broad differential to make sure that we're not missing anything with that whole hope for the best, treat for the worst mentality. By the time they're calling us on flight, we know that they're usually sick. We're sometimes very, very, very sick. Scene jobs. Sometimes someone thinks they're sick and I rather them call us and we find nothing than the opposite. But like a varicose vein isn't a life-threatening hemorrhage. I'm sorry. This just happened over the weekend.
Stop.
It's fine. One finger, the bleeding will stop. It's all good. But maintaining that healthy level of awareness and that open mind is really the key to doing this job safely and effectively.
I like the term that you use, healthy cynicism. Plan for the worst, hope for the best. Could be something wrong, not sure, but doing a really good focused and ongoing assessments and really kind of trust but verify and really getting your hands on the patient, doing these good assessments and really trying to match what you're seeing, what could potentially be there based on your assessment and your vital signs, things like that can really really hone in those skills. And I really like how you termed that healthy cynicism, because you, like you said, you can't just approach that. There's nothing wrong with this, or like you said, you could be way overly aggressive for that varicose vein hemorrhage, like we got a blood alert, we got a trauma alert, we need that. So, but having that good blend of that, I think you really hit that point really well, that use a good judgment, have that high index of suspicion, but trust, verify.
Exactly.
Yeah, if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, and talks like a duck, it's probably a squirrel, right? Like,
Yep.
you just need to have that high index of suspicion, because they like to pull tricks on us all the time.
Exactly. Oh man, it's funny because when we're talking about the overly aggressive, I'm just thinking back, one of my best friends, who is our sim director, when he was in residency, had a similar trauma where they came in with an isolated extremity injury. I think it was a machete he trained down in Miami. With bleeding control, the patient came in, suddenly became hypotensive because, they looked at their arm and they vagal themselves. The trauma team said, oh, there must be a hemorrhage somewhere else. It's a penetrating trauma. We know where the bleeding's coming from. They do an MTP on this patient, slam in, I think, a total of 15 units of product, put the patient into taco plus a trolley. So now the heart's overloaded, the lungs are overloaded. Patient ends up getting intubated. Hemoglobin went somewhere from a 14 up to a 21.
Oh my God.
And then ends up on CRT. And then they're like, whoops.
Ruh-roh.
So like you need to have that healthy level of...
but I think it's so easy to get caught up in those loopholes, right? And I think that's where a lot of this is coming from. You get caught in those loopholes and you start going down this, that spiral starts getting faster and faster and faster, because when something doesn't go right, you're looking in somewhere else, and that doesn't go right, and it just gets you so sidetracked and off your overall game. We all know best laid plans, right? And as soon as we get in there and those best laid plans get thrown to the wayside, like it's a free for all at that point. And you start going down these rabbit holes, and I think it's very easy to get sidetracked. And I think that's sometimes some of the most difficult aspect of our job, is just keeping it all together.
I love how you saved yourself from calling that a Charlie Foxtrot.
We're trying to keep it PG here.
We're about to say it, and that really describes some of these situations. And that's kind of one of the goals here, is to prevent those Charlie Foxtrots from occurring.
Absolutely. And, when we talk about what's going through our minds, right? So you get these, it's your third stroke alert that you've flown for the day, right? So kind of under arousal, the time is brain, right? So you're doing those, right? And now you get number 4 and you're like, another straightforward stroke alert, right? But then is it, so nope. the patient starts to decompensate, and rather quickly. And now you're already patient loaded. You're in the aircraft, right? So where is all your stuff, right? So like you said, that when you were talking about, you didn't prep the room or you didn't prep the team, right? So those are the conversations that we should be having with our partners, right? So you get toned out for this 4th stroke and you're like, yeah, dude, another stroke, So, but then you do your assessment, everything seems fine, but maybe you miss one little thing, and it wasn't just like those bright flashing lights, like, hey, this patient's going to decompensate. It doesn't stand out. And then, and I'm self-admitting this, because then you get in the aircraft and then all of a sudden something changes. So how can we be aware of our, under arousal on what we would think is a rather routine flight or rather routine transport? So how do we overcome the human psyche of keeping ourselves in the game, in that assessment, making sure we're doing everything for the patient? How do we stay focused on that, but not, not going too broad, but also, not with tunnel vision either? So how do we do that for ourselves?
So this is really, really hard. This is incredibly hard, and no one is going to do this well. Especially, this is your 4th stroke, and I'm going to bring up complacency at that point, right? Whether you have it or not, this is really in that subconscious space now, where this is the 4th one. These have all been routine, and then things get missed. It becomes a routine kind of situation, a routine flight for us, and then these things get missed. That's normal. Everyone is going to say this happens to them. It happens to me. On your 5th chest pain of the day, same concept, right? Mm-hmm. Next thing you know, you have these subtle changes on an EKG that you missed because you get handed 20 of them a day. Then you look at the next one, it's another one. Next thing you know, they're in cardiac arrest, and then you realize that there were subtle findings. It happens to everyone. And really the trick to that is proper preparation and then maintaining that consciousness of what's going on and what's happening with that patient. And I'm going to bring up Sigmund Freud, who, I mean, we can talk about him later. When I was in a psych class, they would like to call him the freak of the week. But aside from his controversial kind of parts, what I really like in his talk and how he would like to describe the conscious, preconscious, unconscious is using an iceberg method. And that's really what you're describing here right now, is maintaining consciousness in these areas when we could be complacent. So that preconsciousness is where, okay, I know what's going on. It's just not in the forefront of my memory. It's not in the forefront of my cerebrum, right? It's buried a little bit deeper back. It might have some emotional context, might be hanging out in that amygdala a little bit. But I really want to bring that into that conscious area. So the iceberg kind of analogy here is, imagine you got an iceberg that's floating in the water. Your consciousness is that top part. Your subconscious, your preconsciousness is that part just under the water. It bobs up. That preconsciousness becomes your consciousness. It bobs down. Then it goes back into that preconsciousness. So the preparatory phase is how we bring that preconsciousness, so that complacency, out of that preconsciousness into that consciousness space. And that's really the key, is if you don't think about it, you're not going to do it. Same thing with the differential. If you don't think about it, it's not going to be the diagnosis. It might still exist, but you just missed it.
Yeah.
Same thing here with that preparation. You brought up the stroke. This is the fourth one of the day. Did we think about, hey, could this be an LVO with hemorrhagic conversion? Could this be worsening cerebral edema leading to uncal herniation? And that's why they're presenting that way. It's all those things that it's easy for us to talk about now, but now when we're fatigued, we've been flying all day, we have this complacency, we've got a little bit of tunnel vision. How do we make sure that we remind ourselves we need to do things better? And preparation is really the key, but also understanding what happens to the body when we become stressed. Because as we get stressed, our performance is going to drop off. And I think we're all super aware of that.
And not just your, physical stress, but emotional stress and all of them leading up to that. I mean, you say fourth flight in the day, like we're all tired at that point, mentally and physically exhausted, probably from, depending on what's happened earlier in the day and just the stressors of flight in general. And I think that that's something that certainly plays a huge role in all of this too.
Exactly. And it's just learned behavior.
Yeah.
So we've done multiple flights a day. How do we train our orientees to cope with that? How do we assess ourselves? Because you ask any one of us, and I say this every single day, I'm incredibly privileged to work with a group of 50 type A dominant personalities.
No idea what you're talking about.
I'm sure you all. Who are incredibly high performers and hold themselves to such a high standard. How do we instill those values of, we're human, we make mistakes? This is my fourth flight of the day. I'm approaching that timeout period. Does this flight need to be taken by me, my crew right now? Can this go to someone else? What's my frat score right now? Is it safe for me to fly? Is it safe for me to operate? And I realize that's not really the main context of this podcast today. But this really goes into that in that preparatory phase. Are you in the right mindset to prepare yourself and your team to care for this patient if things don't go in a direction that I was expecting?
Yeah, and I think, I just kind of ran into a similar situation, just the other week. And it was one of those where, again, stroke patient, we get dispatched to go pick up a stroke patient that wasn't quite an LVO, but certainly had enough on their NIH that would suggest they've got a little bit more going on. And we're told they were just on 2 liters nasal cannula, had an IV running, no big deal. We're transferring them to Comprehensive Stroke Center, bring them back to Hershey. And we walk in and there is a whole bunch of commotion going on outside the room and the crash cart's there. And I'm like, what just happened? And they're like, he just started crashing 5 minutes ago. And we're like, okay, well, I did not bring my vent. I did not bring so now we're scrounging around to go back out to the aircraft, get all these other things. And it's like, our spidey senses went down because the information that we got was that this was a stable Mabel kind of patient. We're going to roll in, be in and out of there in less than 10 minutes and be on our way, to where they need to be. And that was not at all the case. An hour and a half later, we finally got everything situated and we're able to get the patient out of there. But it's just, you get caught in that roll, and it like completely throws you off your game. It's just one of those things where like every plan that you had in place is now being thrown out the window, and you've got to start from scratch again and go down a completely different pathway. And I don't think it's always easy to make that transition depending on the situations that you're in.
So, Mike, I'm going to ask you a question based on that. And I don't know whether you're an orientee or not, because that would actually be incredibly helpful. If you did, you can describe how the orientee was. How did you feel? How did your partner feel? What did you feel physiologically and kind of emotionally as the patient was crashing right then?
Yeah, I mean, it was, well, first it was kind of a whole lot of like, what the, and, you know, I'll leave the rest of that phrase out, but like that internal stress level, like you could almost feel your heart rate increasing just standing there kind of taking it all in, what's going on. My initial response is I always kind of like stop and take all of it in and take a look around and figure out what's going on, what everybody's currently doing, what needs to still be done, and then kind of formulate that plan of attack. But you can certainly feel that internal anxiety. You can feel that heart rate going up. And you can kind of feel the general stress level, like the tenseness. The entire body just gets kind of tense in those situations. At least mine did, in that, you know, kind of we're completely changing pathways here now. And like they are still actively resuscitating this patient right now. For me, it was certainly that overall stress increase, both mentally and physically. And no, there was not an orientee present.
Like, have you had similar situations? Because that's really kind of where I want to think about and focus some of this on, is understanding what your physiologic response is going to be to these situations. Because we're all human. So you're going to behave in a predictable way in these situations. And how we train and how we train is how we fight. So when we know and we recognize that we're going to have these physiologic responses, that's how we know how we're going to perform.
Thanks to our sponsor, Airbus. Airbus provides the most efficient helicopter solutions to its customers who serve, protect, save lives, and safely carry passengers in demanding environments. Its civil and military helicopters are flying all over the world, making missions possible. Visit airbus.com for more information.
I feel it. You know, I can think back to a call, 6 months ago, a pediatric seizure, and kind of the same thing. Oh, okay. They're seizing. It's probably febrile, you're like, this would be cool. We'll grab the kiddo, we'll treat, and we'll go. 1,000% not the case. We end up, the child is actively in status seizure, not ventilating well, not oxygenating well, airway secretions. So everything that you could think of. And then the age was, dispatched as a 3-year-old, and it's like, just kidding, it's an 11-month-old, so so, and just based on your dispatch info, you're like, oh yeah, okay, kids seize, they have fevers, and then when you open the doors to the ambulance and you see everything happening, your mind and your body, you go from 0 to 100, and also it was at night, so you kind of wind down. You just start to kind of get that drift off to sleep, and then you get woken up. So there's that lull, and then going to this, and I just feel the anxiety, and you feel your heart racing. You start to get that little lightheadedness, and then you're like, I got to hold this together, and like I'm inside, I'm screaming, but you're like, all right, we got to do something. But yeah, I easily feel that physiologic response within my body. And it's, over the years, I don't know, do we become addicted to that feeling? Almost. Maybe somewhat, yeah. Not that, I'm not addicted to, these things happening to patients, right? But like, this is what, like you said, it's kind of how we train or how we get to that point. So do we thrive in those environments? Maybe that initial response, but then when things don't go the way that you thought they would, I'm definitely not addicted to that. And I definitely don't want that to happen. But to bring that back, I guess feeling that response in your overall body, in your mind, you have just a matter of seconds to get it together and try to go down and do what you've been trained to do, or things can really tail off pretty quickly.
And that's really, I think, the key here, because you just made, and I'm going to reference a couple of those parts because I think it's incredibly important. One is the recognition phase. It's very normal for us to get that immediate sympathomimetic response. We should have that response. And you say we thrive on it because we do. And if we look at human performance, when we get that level of stress, we perform better. There's that magic point somewhere in that 90, 120 heart rate range. Your stress level's going up. You're becoming more focused. You're more attuned to what's going on. You perform better. When do we perform awful? We perform when we're in that complete, I'm tired. I don't want to do anything. My parasympathetics are doing anything. And I don't want you to stay and play, but the fight or flight versus your kind of stay and play area. When you're in that stay and play, relax, I'm just doing whatever. I'm eating, I'm drinking, having a good time. You're seeing one patient an hour. If you're working in the ED, you haven't had any flights for the day. You're just hanging out with everyone. That is equally as unsafe as if you just had everything hit the fan and it splattered on the walls and the ceiling and you can't see out the door and your glasses and all over your body. And you're like, oh my God, you will perform equally as terribly in those two situations.
Yeah.
So having that initial response, when you hear those tones go off, when you get that initial jolt, all of us are addicted to it. And that's why we do this job. That's why people go on roller coasters. But having to know when I'm falling off, when am I getting too stressed? When am I falling off of that cliff? Really, and I'm going to bring up the graph now when we're talking about heart rate versus reaction. When we get into that black, and that's really the key, because we have our human performance curve. And I don't know if we're able to pull that up now. This is a great, so we can just put up this would be the performance versus stress curve. When we have that performance versus stress, this is where I'm talking about. Your stress is 0, your performance is 0. You're burnt out, you're incredibly stressed, your heart rate's 160, you're over the top, you've fallen off that cliff, you're in the black, if you will. That's when we're going to perform poorly as well. The trick is you want to have a mild amount of stress, a little bit of an elevated heart rate, and then be attuned to what's going on with your own body physiologically. So once you're really in that yellow, so this is a great time where you can, on the YouTube channel, put the ascending graph with heart rate versus reaction. So when you're in that yellow range, you're going to lose some of your fine motor skills, but not a lot. And for the most part, in resuscitative medicine, we're not doing tons of fine motor skills unless you're cannulating for ECMO. And even so, you're hitting pretty large blood vessels under ultrasound guidance. It's not that bad. Unless your hand is super, you shouldn't be putting a needle near anyone, especially not a scalpel.
I assure you that would be my hand if I was the one putting in ECMO.
Yeah. Hey, can you get that IV? And you're like, oh, let me open that, and your heart rate's going and you're trying to find where the package opens. Like that's what happens to me to my fine motor skills there.
So I would actually say that's way more of your complex motor skills or even your gross motor skills at that point. And we've all seen those
REMs. Then the ship is sunk at that point.
Oh yeah, the med students where they can't open the IV catheter, they can't open up an empty syringe, and you're like, all right, you need to sit down.
Yeah.
I mean, and there are techniques you can do to kind of prevent this, and then once you're going through it, help with it. But that's really what we're talking about here is you have your best laid plans and then things get a little derailed. And you're like, okay, you get a little bit more stress. Now things really get derailed and now you're getting really stressed. And that's where you really need to understand how your human performance is going to be affected by this. That's really the key to all of this is understanding I'm stressed. My motor skills are going to go to, my true assessment skills, my ability to cognitively process information is going to be, I don't want to say distorted, but it actually is distorted. And we're going to show that a little bit later, but your perception of what's going on, your perception of reality might be different than what is actually going on.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like I've encountered a lot of those situations over my career. And I feel like a lot of that compounds too. So yeah, we start to get that gut instinct or those spidey senses that go off before we even go into situations. But there's so many situations that we go into where that derailment has already happened or is in the process of happening. And it's like you have to regroup and sometimes finding that groove, I feel like those are the calls where you just feel like nothing goes right. Nothing goes according to plan. Everything that you want. And you just I end up feeling now, like I feel like I get very frustrated. And I know that my partners probably get frustrated with me at times where I am so, type A and OCD about how we're setting things up, where we're setting things up, where all of our lines are going to, where all, what kind of just the way that we place the monitor or the ventilator and how we're setting ourselves up for success. Because if I don't have easy access to the information that I need, and I have to now struggle to get to where this, this information is that I want, it really gets very frustrating for me very quickly. And I find as I'm getting older, that tolerance for that frustration becomes much less. But it's those super high stress situations where I definitely feel that coming on.
And that's completely normal. It's completely predictable. So if you don't already have it up, you would have the unified model of stress performance while we're talking about this a little bit. So that graph, but that's super normal, and you should have that. And I mean, granted, I feel like the more attendeer I get, I agree. I like having things a little bit more of a certain way, and like, this is my way of doing things. And I know you guys, when I first became the medical director and I changed up a lot of things, there was a lot of pushback from it because, hey, we've been doing this for 20, 30 years. Why are we changing it up? That being said, our adaptability is also what separates us from different types of providers, because we have to be able to adapt. We have to be able to change gears rapidly. I'm going for a 2 liter per minute stroke patient to they're peri-arresting and I don't know why.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And I think, it's interesting when you talking about, how you physiologically are affected in these situations and how you're mentally affected in these situations, and our overall perception of the situation. Like, is this something like, I feel like, okay, so, the old mantra is, well, I've done it so many times, I can remember what I need to do in those situations. Like, how much do you really feel that memory plays into a lot of what we're doing in these high stress situations? Or is it something that we can't really rely on in those situations?
So studies have shown you can't rely on your memory. And like I said before, your perception of reality is different. During your debriefs, you might remember the situation. And I'm going to separate this from your memory on how I'm doing procedures and skills and protocols is different than your memory of the events, because your skills, your procedures, your algorithms, your critical thinking skills to assess the patient, that is, we train the way we fight. That's why we do high fidelity simulations. That's why we practice not until we get it right. We practice till we can't get it wrong. And we do micro skills. We'll do deliberate practice, which I'll talk a little bit later. Those are learned skills, learned behaviors. When we're talking about memory of the event, your perception is completely unreliable in these circumstances.
Awesome.
Glad
I've got something else to rely on.
One of the best examples, especially in resuscitative environments, is when we're doing an RSI. And I don't know, Blake, the last time you did an RSI, and are you a sucks or a rock shot?
Rock.
All right, perfect. Do you remember how long you waited in between pushing your paralytic to intubate last time?
I was actually training somebody. So yes, I waited honestly 2 minutes. We did the full, like, counting it down, actually did it the way that we're supposed to. And I remember, I think 4 times somebody asked, do you want to go ahead and push the rock? No. So I was like, we need to wait till we know that they're fully sedated, right? So we did ketamine rock, and so then once we push the rock, again, waiting, and it's like, all right, we ready? No, we need to wait. And then, like you said, your memory and recollection of that, it seems like we could have been at the hospital by that time, by the time we waited that they were fully paralyzed. But so yes, honest to God, the last one I did, yes, but I will wholeheartedly admit, we go by what we're trained, and we're like, okay, yeah, I think they're paralyzed now. What we think is a minute, 2 minutes is probably 30 seconds at the most.
Yeah.
And that's what every study shows. Every single study shows that time slows down when you're in these times of stress, and people are pushing rock and they're not waiting that 1 minute. They're 15 seconds, 20 seconds. Then you ask them after, how long did you wait? They're like, went 2 minutes. And you're like, that was 15 seconds. Yeah. So if that's 2 minutes to you, someone is lying to you at home.
Absolutely.
For sure.
Here for a good time, not a long time, right?
No, but I mean, that's exactly what I mean. I can think back to countless situations where it almost just seems like time has stood still. And maybe it's in that whole, like, for me, that whole information gathering process and and I'm walking into this chaotic, overwhelming situation, and I have to figure out everything that's going on all within a matter of seconds. And it feels like time just stands still. It's like you're, looking around the room and no one's doing anything. No one's moving. It feels like everything is standing still. It's almost that out of body experience until you're able to kind of take it all in. And then it's like all of a sudden you get that, like, you snap into gear and you start doing things and directing what needs to happen and go down that pathway. But those few moments until you're able to like process that all really feels like time is just, non-existent.
And you also lose that sense of clarity in that moment. You get distortions, and we know you get visual distortions. We've done studies on it. And then you also get that tunnel vision effect as well. I've got a great picture that I like to use from the Maui fires of you get a beautiful view of the ocean and you're like, oh, it's tranquil, it's peaceful. And then when you zoom out, everything is on fire around you.
Yeah.
And that's really, and we just talked about it this morning in a case review where you're focusing on that tree and you're losing the forest. And that's when we're in these high stress situations. You're going to become task saturated. You're going to become task focused. This is also why the team leader shouldn't be the proceduralist. They're focusing in on that one thing and they'd be like, hey, look, that IV looks great and look perfect and the patient's still dead.
Yeah, exactly. And I think, I find I almost feel like guilty after some of these like really complex calls where we've had to do a whole lot of changes to actively resuscitate this patient. I feel guilty afterwards because I say to my partner, I'm like, I'm sorry, I feel like I wasn't doing anything. But it's because I'm standing back and making sure that everything that needs to get done is getting done and delegating that to the appropriate people to make sure that that's happening. I feel like I'm not doing anything but writing it all down and directing the orchestra, the symphony at that point in time. But like, I feel guilty that I'm not helping my partner in those moments. But I also know that if I get task saturated in those situations, I'm going to lose all concept of everything else that needs to be done.
And we see that time and time again. And that's why we work as a team. That's what happens. And I'm not going to directly call out single provider ALS units. And I was one of them. But that's really one of the arguments against single provider ALS units, at least at a critical care level, but even at the street ALS level. Having that partner where one person is the proceduralist and the other one's the team leader, maintaining that 10,000 foot view is necessary. The person doing the procedure, they're getting more stressed. They're like, I have to do X, Y. I need to do X. I need to do Y. I need to I need to hang this presser. The person stepping back has that ability to take it all in, to really control their heart rate, control their emotions, control their physiologic response to the situation. And that's one of the bigger takeaways from this talk is take a step back. There's always a second to take a step back. Don't lose the forest. You need to maintain view of that forest. If you're staring at the tree or even that bark or even the one piece of grass, that one blade, you need to make sure that you've got a full 360 of that patient about what's going on with that situation.
One of the things that I've started to try to implement and utilize in my day-to-day practice, when I'm not on the aircraft, I'm on a first response critical care SUV. So we run first response to any of these high acuity calls and we try to help out wherever needed. So one of the things that I really try to do when we either get requested to do a call or we get dispatched, I'm not normally the first person there. Sometimes we are. But when we're there to try to help, I really try to implement that like kind of provider timeout, right? So I approach it the same way. If I arrive in a helicopter or I arrive on the SUV, I try to get the report from whoever's there. And I really try to take that mental like kind of time out in my head. And I'm doing it and just actively listening. And I try to repeat it back. And I try to take, like you said, I want that kind of like 1,000 foot view. I really want to make sure that I'm getting all the information and really trying to get my eyes on everything and then really seeing where things need to go. Because they may already have everything set and it's going the right way. There's nothing else I need to do. Like you said, Mike, sometimes you're just like, okay, man, you guys have kind of got this. I can just kind of stand back and I'm here to help in whichever way that needs. Or if you do need to step in, then you can. But trying to do like practicing and then putting it into implementation and muscle memory. Can you kind of further elaborate on that, on how we can train as critical care providers and how we can train to make sure that we are approaching it maybe in that type of format where we don't miss those things and still implement good care for our patients.
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.
So I'm more than happy to. And before I do that, I want to bring up a concept that kind of talks about this. So one is deliberate practice. And then the other part of this, and I said it before, was don't practice till you're right, practice till you can't get it wrong. And how did this come about? How did we say, oh, how much practice is needed? Do you think it was medicine? It's never medicine. Medicine is never the first place we come up with these concepts. We do it in random other places, and then we're like, this is pretty applicable to medicine. So this was actually first studied with musicians. And it was how many hours of practice do you need to get, and they have specific grading that we're not going to get too deep into, but how long does it take to become an expert at piano? How many hours of practice does it take? And then they looked at people who became experts. And then, of course, if you're doing a retrospective study, which we can't really trust, they're like, okay, all the experts took about, I think it was 50 or 30-ish thousand hours worth of training. They're like, okay, so now let's go to some of these amateurs and see how much training they had. And they found some of them also have the same amount of training. So you're like, was it the training? And that became and I don't know if age-wise, but then growing up, it wasn't practice makes perfect. Then it was perfect practice makes perfect to say, hey, I need to be practicing correctly to get better. Right. Which then brings up the whole concept of deliberate practice and micro skills. So that's where you're taking your practice. But if I'm doing the same piano riff every single time and I'm doing it wrong every single time, that's not helping anyone. But if I break it down into piece by piece and I make this small piece better, then I take the next small piece better, the next small piece better, then ultimately when I string them together, I'm going to have much better performance as opposed to someone who's trying to do the same thing over time. So our goal is to get more of a stepwise progression of skill improvement while we're still maintaining that level of proficiency. So this is a great time that we could do the performance versus time graph, because that really describes what we're talking about. And then as we're going step by step up this ladder, we're getting this constant micro skill feedback loop. So we are practicing, we're refining our skills, and then someone is giving us feedback. Now, does it have to be another expert giving feedback? Not necessarily. It could also be yourself. A great way to do this is doing video analysis of your own intubations. This is why we just switched over to video. It's for this process. So you can watch yourself intubate and be like, wow, my face was all the way up in there. Or we've all seen it.
Right? Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
But this is not okay.
But it's definitely, it's humbling to see that. But I mean, that I was just going to say that's, it's just like airway practice. It's not about just throwing plastic in plastic. Right? Like it's, you need to deliberately go through the steps and talk through your protocol and how you're going to set things up and where you're going to be standing in the room, and then getting that muscle memory on top of it. Because if you're just throwing plastic in plastic, it's not doing anyone any good.
It's doing nothing. It is not helping anyone. And kind of more importantly, it's not helping yourself. It's not helping your patients. If you're going through the motions because I have to do my 3 airways a month, boom, plastic and plastic, we're done. That's not why we do this. That's not how we maintain competency. That's not how we even maintain proficiency. But ultimately, our goal is not proficiency. Our goal is perfection. So it's taking those each individual micro skills and making it better. We're working on our ultrasound protocols right now. So how do we maintain it? It's first learning. Let's use ultrasound IVs, for example, because that's a great complex skill that requires multiple complex micro skills. So that's image acquisition, vessel selection, and then how you hold the needle, how the needle enters the skin, the angle, following the needle tip into the vessel, then walking it through the vessel and then advancing the catheter. Each one of those is a micro skill. Each one is a step. We talk about airways because airways probably the most important things we do. But how often do you train your orientee? This is how you open a mouth correctly. This is how you do a scissor. This is how much space you should have. This is how you enter into the mouth. This is how you keep the tongue, whether you're using a standard geometry blade versus hyperangulate. Or are we delineating which one we're using? Because there's a different technique between the two of them.
Yeah.
You're going to get a different view. I can't tell you how many times I've seen people try and use a standard geometry blade sweeping technique with a hyperangulated blade. And they're like, what issue am I having? I was like, that's not the geometry.
Yeah.
Or worse, you go in with a hyperangulated and they're lifting up. And I'm like, I just can't see anything. Those are the micro skills that all come together to perform a complex task. And you have to practice them.
Yeah, no doubt. And I feel like there are a lot of things that, you know, as medicine evolves, especially in our world, we always seem to be evolving behind where everything else is, in that we always have to adapt it to how it works in our environment. And it's all these learning of new skills. And like you said, Garrett, you know, when you came in as medical director, there were a lot of changes that happened. Like, it was a big learning curve for, I think, a lot of providers, myself included. I mean, we have a lot of either newer or different equipment or skill sets and ability to perform things out there that it took a lot of deliberate practice in order to feel comfortable in those situations. And I still say it's not necessarily, I mean, I'm undoing years of training in other methods or techniques. So it's still not necessarily something that is ingrained in my muscle memory. It's still something that I consciously think about every single time I'm doing some of these skills. But it's about having that deliberate practice to gain that muscle memory back again.
And that's okay. And that's completely okay, because you're maintaining that in that consciousness and you're aware of what's going on in that conscious space. The challenge is when it's in that subconscious, that preconscious space, and you're getting really, really stressed about it, because that's when we see people will regress back down. It's kind of fun. Back when I was a lot more in the field, especially at the ALS level, you could always tell, and no disrespect to any of the BLS providers who've been BLS providers for years and years and years, but I can't tell you how often we've gotten on scene and I could tell what iteration of BLS or ACLS someone was initially trained on based on the therapies that they were given.
Yep.
Without fail, you're walking in and, oh yeah, I've been giving 0.5 of atropine to this bradycardic PEA, and I'm like, all right, late 90s, got it.
Yeah, you can definitely tell how you revert back to that prior state where, you know, it may be decades old medicine, but that's what you knew back then and you were very competent in back then, and that's your comfort zone, right? And how your brain just automatically takes you back to those places.
I mean, without going too much detail, I had a case like that yesterday where I got called in to go intubate a 7-year-old with a polysubstance ingestion. And the other provider, who's been a physician for 30 plus years, was just not having it, just based on new equipment, new techniques, new everything, and the reversion back to the old practice of medicine, which was not working. But part of that was that recognition of, we need to do something else and something that's different, and how do we perform better? And it's very easy to do when I can just phone a friend. We don't work in that environment. You're phoning a friend as your partner standing next to you. Mm-hmm. So
right, exactly.
How do you prepare yourself in the moment so that it doesn't come to that? I think that's one of the other keys with human performance.
Well, I think we have to have those honest, tough conversations within our own mind, right?
Yeah.
That those aren't the times to have an ego. You know, those are not the times to be afraid or ashamed. You know, practice, you know, like you said, doing it until you can't get it wrong. But if you're having difficulty along those ways, or something just isn't going right, we should be able to rely on our partner, or like you said, we can get a hold of somebody else to maybe help us, give us that other kind of view to just keep us whole. And like you said, that's what really helps the team dynamic, to really make sure that we're all going on the same page, because it's hard for one person to solely be the sole person doing everything, right? having to do all the assessment, right? To having to do all the procedures because if, somebody else isn't having it or they can't, it's a lot for one provider to try to manage. So it's really important that and like you said, doing that deliberate practice, not only just in skills, but we should have that mindset, and where we know how we're getting during that process. If things aren't starting to go right, if we can recognize that and ask for help before it gets too late, it sounds like that should really be also part of our deliberate practice and how we train.
I think obviously we've, had a lot of discussions specifically surrounding resuscitationist and the mindset of the medical crew, but like, how do we apply this to the entire crew that's out there on a helicopter? Because this is not just about taking care of a patient. Like, I feel like these concepts can be applied on a much higher level, or broader level, I should say, when you talk about the entire crew involving, our pilots, mechanics, comm specs, and of course medical crew then. But how do we apply that to the entire team concept? Because these are obviously things that everybody is feeling in those high stress environments. Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Valor Flight Crew podcast. Don't forget to like and subscribe to hear more stories that promote the personnel and equipment behind the missions in public safety aviation. Lastly, stand by for a message from our sponsors.
Thanks to our sponsor, Airbus. Airbus provides the most efficient helicopter solutions to its customers who serve, protect, save lives, and safely carry passengers in demanding environments. Its civil and military helicopters are flying all over the world, making missions possible. Visit airbus.com for more information.
Thank you to our sponsor, Metro Aviation. Metro Aviation, the world's largest family-owned aeromedical operator, offers comprehensive aircraft services with 140 plus aircraft in over 25 states. The Completion Center installs medical and law enforcement kits and avionics, serving diverse aviation needs including offshore, utility, VIP, and corporate sectors.
Thank you to our sponsor, Precision Aviation Group. Mission-critical operators and fleet managers rely on Precision Aviation Group as a worldwide leading rotor and fixed-wing MRO provider. PAG provides tip-to-tail solutions in 4 MRO segments: avionics, components, engines, and manufacturing DER services. A single point of contact gives you access to over 150 million in inventory globally, 24/7. Just call 800-537-2778. Precision Aviation Group. Others sell parts. We sell support.
That's a wrap on this episode of the Valor Flight Crew podcast. A big thanks to Dr. Garrett Cavaliere for bringing the heat and the insight on what it really takes to stay sharp in the high-stress world of critical care transport. If you took something away from this conversation, whether it's a mindset shift, a training tip, or just a reminder to breathe, be sure to share it with your crews. Remember, don't practice until you get it right. Practice until you can't get it wrong. We hope you enjoyed this conversation, and don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and keep the conversation going with us on the socials. Until next time, stay ready, train deliberately, and be the calm in the chaos that our patients and crews depend on. Be safe, everyone, and we'll see you next week for another great conversation promoting the personnel and life-saving equipment behind helicopter air ambulance services.